Good morning. Good morning from Hong Kong. I know it's evening in the U.S. East Coast. It's January 6th, Friday, January 6th. Happy New Year. This is our first program of the year of 2023, and it's also our first online program of the year. As many of you know, we have done this series, COVID update series, since 2020, February of 2020. And one of the reasons is COVID kind of started around here, around January 23rd. I looked up the date. Hong Kong got its first case, January 23rd, reported case, January 23rd, 2020. So it's very fitting that 3 years in, episode 45, that we now have an opportunity to talk about the disruption in education. Throughout the series, we brought you speakers initially talking about the infection and mask wearing, social distancing, vaccines, drug treatment, mental health. And so today, episode 45, we're really delighted we have education expert from the United States to talk about disruption in education. This series really got started because of Hong Kong's experience with SARS in 2003. We learned a lot from that painful lesson. Although SARS was short, Hong Kong was at the front line, and so we thought in January of 2020 we had something to share with the world. And little did I know that episode 45, 3 years later, we would still be doing this series. And I'm hoping, very much sincerely hoping, that this year will be it. This series will end very soon in 2023. But in the meantime, it is really Asia Society Hong Kong's pleasure to be able to bring you experts from all over the world to talk about the impact of COVID on us. So today I'm going to start off by introducing somebody who has done some great research in this area of education, in education reform or education policy in the United States. Professor Susanna Loeb is a professor of education at Stanford University and director of National Student Support Accelerator. Prior to returning to Stanford, Professor Loeb was director of the Annenberg Institute for School Reform and professor of education and of international and public affairs at Brown University. Many of the research that she has done has been affiliated with the Annenberg Institute for School Reform, which you can see online. So with that, I really am delighted Professor Loeb is joining us from the U.S. East Coast this evening for her time to tell us some of the stuff that she has kind of researched and learned from the impact of the pandemic on education and the disruption for the students. So Professor Loeb, I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Oh, terrific. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion tonight, or for me tonight, for you in the morning. Let me try to share my screen and see if this will work. Okay, can you see that? So I'm going to talk about the educational effects of the pandemic and the response that we've been working on in the US, particularly around high impact tutoring. So in the US, what happened to the students? What we saw over the first year, so for us, it was really March of 2020 when COVID hit the US and the schools closed. We saw that by September, so by that spring, the students were about 3 months behind. And then May of 2021, so after the full year out of school, for many students, they were more like 5 months behind in math and about 4 months behind in English language arts on average. If you look at our national test, we've done that over time, and this shows it from 1990 to 2022. And what you see from this is that we had actually made some progress as a country over time, and what the pandemic did was to bring us back about 20 years in terms of the achievement gains that we have. And because it had been such a long time of increasing scores and more in some states and others, we could really see that in places that had increasing scores also had increasing graduation rates, attendance in college, all these good things that came with it. And so these drops, even though they may not look so great on this map, really are likely to have big consequences for the students that are in school unless we figure out ways to address them. The other thing that was important to see is that the pandemic did not hit all students equally, and it really increased the variation in students' performance. And I like this graph because there's an assessment that's not given to all students, but that's given to millions of students across the country, where you can really see growth across years. And here, for example, the first column is third grade to fifth grade, how much their test scores rose over time. And it shows you what happened in the years of the pandemic to across third graders to fifth, those third graders as they went to fifth graders, relative to what it was prior to the pandemic. And what this shows us, if you look all the way over on the left-hand side, this 39 says that on average, the students who were performing in the lowest fifth, they only made it to the 39th percentile. So not nearly to where they would have been if they prior to the pandemic. But students who were higher achieving in each of these groups, the ones over to the right, you can see they're more at like 50, even 52 or 58 in reading. In math, it's about in the 40s. What that says is those higher achieving students lost much less. They're much more similar to what had happened before. So from this, we see that not only did we see this drop, but the drop affected the students who were lowest performing the most. Similar graphs could be shown for students from low-income households, Black and Hispanic students. Students who had struggled prior to the pandemic were much more likely to be negatively impacted. So what do you do? Well, as a nation and in the groups that I'm in, we really scan the research base for information on what you can do to help kids who are far behind. So it's not just that you need good schools that help all kids, but are there ways that we know from the research to really accelerate learning? And what emerged is we really only know one way to do this, and that is these intensive tutoring programs. And there have been a lot of randomized control trials, which are these research studies that do a really good job of isolating the effects of a program. And from those studies, these are the number of studies that show different amounts of gains. What you see all the way on the right is that most of the studies showed really large effects of these intensive tutoring programs. It also, from the research, you can see that the tutoring programs are much more effective, they're the orange bars, than other similarly resource-intensive kind of interventions like class size reduction or professional development. Things that take resources aren't nearly as effective as tutoring, intensive tutoring at increasing student achievement. And these numbers, just to give a sense, is that over the course of a year, you could get an extra somewhere between 6 months and 18 months of learning from some of these high impact tutoring programs. So they're really kind of substantively effective. The research here is unusually strong, like there have been a lot of these studies, but it's not necessarily surprising. So what this kind of tutoring does is it targets students' needs. So instead of a student having to learn a whole class, they could just learn what they don't know if the programs use data to get them to know what the students need. And they also can build close relationships since it's one-on-one or one-on-two. They really get to know each other, and that can create relationships where students are willing to take risks and they feel responsible to do the work. And so logic shows that it could be effective. And there's also, as you know, particularly in Asia, because you see this even more where you are than in the US, there's huge demand. And parents that can pay for tutoring have often paid for tutoring. In the US in 2020, we spent more than $40 billion on tutoring for private tutoring. But the thing that we saw in the research literature is it was also clear that not all tutoring is effective, particularly when you try to scale it. So we had this No Child Left Behind policy at the beginning of the 2000s, where students who were in schools that weren't doing well could use school money to opt in to tutoring programs, but very few students took it up, and those that did didn't do very well. Like, it didn't really matter very much, but they weren't intensive. And one study did a really nice job of looking across places and did find some positive effects when there were minimum dosage requirements and the sessions were really structured and the tutors coordinated with schools and the tutors had experience. So there are indications that you could have good effects, but in this case, it didn't work. So our question was whether we can change practice at scale without reducing quality and really try to get students this kind of high impact tutoring. So what we did was we went to the research literature, basically from education and health and communications, to try to understand what we know about scaling. And we found that these 4 issues were really important when you're thinking about taking something and trying to get it out to lots and lots and lots of students, particularly in a decentralized system like the US, where a lot of decisions are made at district level. So 14,000 of them in the country, or at the school level. Certainly the intervention itself is important. So the better if it's a better program, it's going to scale more. And so that's a really positive thing, but it also needs to be compatible with current processes. So it's much easier to scale a better textbook where you just take the textbook and switch it out than it is to scale something that requires you to change the human resources, the adults in the school, or change the schedule or something like that. So characteristics of the intervention. Implementation capacity, the capacity of places to actually put something in that's new, is really important. And it's also, if places don't have that capacity, supports for change is also really important to help schools or districts that wouldn't normally be able to make this change on its own. There could be these outside resources that help them make that change. And then the last area that isn't thought of quite as much is the importance of communication. So that if it's really important that educators at the school level, or for us at a district level, could be at a municipality level, need to make decisions, it's important that the people that they listen to communicate with them and engage them in this. And so the communication process is important as well. And then, of course, there's the policy and economic environment for how much money there is to make changes, and whether there are requirements to put this in as well. And thinking about this from the research literature told us that we should do research on a number of these things, such as how do you make the intervention better in different contexts? What kind of implementation capacity is there? Are there parts of tutoring that are easier to implement and others that aren't? And can we figure out how to develop capacity supports for implementation? Can we develop these tools and technical assistance? For communications, how do we engage people? Who are the main stakeholders and decision makers, and who do they listen to? And what kind of policies really can help push this forward? And so what we found from the research literature, if you want to take research and make impact with it, is that it can be done. There's evidence of it. There's a bunch in public health where it's taken a really long time to make the changes in the US, but they have been made. But it takes effort if you want to make changes like this that are a change to a typical education system. It's not just a function of the intervention, whether it scales. Someone says, is this a scalable intervention? Well, it's not just about how effective it is. It's also about all these other things that you have to think about. And because, I sit in a university, what was important to me is that universities could have a really important role to play because they can bring the multidisciplinary perspectives that would allow you to get at all these pieces and also produce the kind of evidence that in some places is a trustworthy voice in a time when so much information is coming at us. So we developed this National Student Support Accelerator to try to equalize access to quality tutoring with the vision that every student in need would have access to an effective tutor who can really champion and ensure their learning and success. And to do this, we took 3 steps, which is very similar to what I just showed you, which is to try to take what we know and both build our knowledge, but also build the knowledge through new research, but actually try to pull together and synthesize what we know in a way that people can use it. To facilitate implementation, take that knowledge, create tools, do some kinds of strategic advising, and also try to engage and activate stakeholders to really try to meet the needs of students. All these students, in many districts, it's more than half of students who really are now not being able to work at grade level. So we started by reviewing all these hundreds of studies that had been done and saying, what are common elements of effective tutoring programs? In most cases, we haven't had tests of is it okay to have 2 students per tutor, or can you only have 1? There aren't good tests of that, but you can see which programs are effective and what their characteristics are. So we spent a lot of time pulling that together so that we could drive our tools and engagement around that. And we created tools and technical assistance. So we created a toolkit for tutoring programs so that they could all the tutoring programs that were out there already could kind of try to align themselves with what we know from the research. We created this tutor quality improvement system where programs can go in and enter what they do and get immediate report that basically tells them how to align. We did the same thing with a district that either wanted to build a new program or to use a program that was out there in partnership and how to do that. We tried to make these, much of my research has been on how you get adult behavior change in schools. And so we were really careful to make the tools that we created really easy to use, really clear, and directed towards the audience that they were for. So the tool for districts is actually really long, but because they've got a lot of detailed work to do, but there's a checklist and it walks you through really carefully. Whereas our tools for policymakers are a page, because that's about as much as you can get people to read who have so many different policies that they have to do. And then engagement, we just worked with a whole bunch of different groups. This is a picture of of the team that we worked with from our teachers' unions. To really help us understand who the decision makers are and how to influence those decision makers. One of the things that proved to be really important in getting this information out and having people take it up is to be really clear about what it is the research says. As a researcher, I'm used to saying, well, we know this and not this, and it gets really complicated. And we always said, this isn't perfect and we're going to improve this as it goes, but right now this is what the research says is our best guess about what makes tutoring effective. And it's really about developing that close relationship between a tutor and a student, targeting the student's needs, and doing it for a lot of time, over a long period of time. And so there are things like data use and training of tutors and things like that we could outline as what was really needed. And then we did a bunch of research, and this is, I'm a researcher, so we have studies on understanding implementation and scaling. We have random control trials, experiments on programs that may change and be more cost effective. We have features of programs so that we know what the cost is, for example, changing the ratios or changing the amount of time. And then we're using tutoring, particularly online tutoring, to better understand learning overall. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples. So to understand the implementation, we really tried to get a wide variety of schools, from small rural schools to schools in the South and the North and the East and the West, and urban and rural and suburban, to see what it was like to implement tutoring and what the barriers were and what the facilitators were for implementation. And some of our initial results is that one of the things that drives implementation and really helps is a broad belief among educators and parents that this really is what students need. They need this close adult attention really targeted towards their needs. There are school models that make this easier when they have already set aside time for students to do something that isn't in a big group. But there are barriers. Our educators were exhausted. Changing the schedules for students is really hard, procurement and background checks. And then it's a really hard time for attracting adults for all jobs in the US, not just for expanding the number of adults you'd need in school to have tutors there. We found some parts of tutoring were easier to implement. So schools are good at selecting and training and oversight of tutors, but the low ratios, getting enough tutors in there and doing it frequently, fit into the schedule was really, really difficult. Because it turns out to be much more effective if it's done during the school day, because for us, that's how you get the kids who are most disconnected to show up. Once they go home, it's really hard to get students who are disengaged in school to actually choose to engage. And then, the Biden administration put a lot of money into this, and that, of course, helped a lot. While labor market conditions, on the other hand, made it a little bit harder. So that's just an example. Then these randomized control trials are testing things like students per tutor and tutor characteristics. Are there better matches when you're trying to match students to tutors? What kind of pre-service training for tutors is important? Just kind of testing these kinds of things through A/B tests. I just want to give you two quick examples, because one was really amazing as we just did this basic test of a program. And, for high school kids and middle school kids, you really need a lot of tutoring, 3 to 5 times a week, and for a whole class period. So that's a lot of time that these high impact tutoring programs have, and you have to get it into the schedule. But for kindergarteners and first graders, they are also really badly hit by the pandemic, particularly in learning to read, which is so important. But they don't have concentration for 45 minutes. So in some ways that's bad, but in other ways, it means that you can fit these kind of 10-minute tutoring into your school day. If you just have an additional adult in the classroom, that adult can meet with almost every kid almost every day. And if you can use technology so that the tutor knows exactly what the student needs, they can really address that, since we know our knowledge of what makes good reading, teaching for learning how to read, the science of learning how to read is pretty good. They can actually do that. And what we found in this one district where we tested, we did a randomized control trial, is that with this approach, at the end of kindergarten, about 30% of kids in the district were proficient in the way they were meant to be. But the kids who had this, who were randomly assigned, far more, almost 70% were. So it was just a huge change in kids learning to read. So this isn't a small change. This is a really big change. And then just in a separate example that we did was we did a study of opt-in tutoring, where instead of having this program that's in school, we looked at what happens in a program where kids are supposed to opt in. And it's, parents, we sent parents a lot of things, the students all were taught how to opt in. the take-up was really, really low. And it was much lower, less than half for low-performing kids than for high-performing kids. And I think this is really important because it's really easy to give this kind of opt-in. Anyone can do it at home and get tutoring, but this isn't the high-impact tutoring. So that's just another example of a study that we did on this. So just some highlights. I think states and districts are really taking up tutoring, creating policy guidelines, using the guidelines that we've created and the tools that we've created. We've had, over 200,000 visitors and people who use it. We've provided strategic advising in a lot of places. We've created these networks of educators who are working towards this. So I think there's a lot more students have access to it. It's the primary approach for addressing learning loss across the country, with about 65% of states using their federal funding for this. But it's a work in progress. We found indications that there are lots of ways to facilitate scaling, because many places, it's not just like they take a program and put it in, they change it to their situation. Maybe they can't recruit tutors locally, so they put it online. Maybe they don't have the ability to recruit, so they hire a firm to do that. There are lots of different ways of doing it. We really need the infrastructure, including state policies, in order to help make these changes. And there's a great need for research that's linked to it as well. But if you want to see any more about this, you can go onto our website, which is just studentsupportaccelerator.org. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I now want to kind of go back to some of the fundamentals from this. I think we kind of learned about some of the impact from this the National Assessment of Education Progress, and you in your presentation point out the kind of the score, the NAP came out in September, and it's showing, I think this is the ninth graders, right? Or nine-year-old, fourth graders, how they were impacted because of this last 3 years in terms of COVID. And I think one of the interesting thing I in reading some of the report was the difference between we know the reading score and as well as a math score, both went down. And math, it's interesting that math is usually taught at schools, right? You can read at home. I think some families, read regularly with their kids and so on. So reading, you can read anywhere. Whereas I think math is primarily something that's done at school and how that's impacted. So can you talk about how, in terms of tell us a little bit more about NAEP, what you have taken away from that result, and how, kind of that information can be shared. Can we glean from that for Asia, where in tutoring is something that we're very, very familiar with? I think, unfortunately, the kids from day one, parents have really, you have companies here who are majoring in tutoring as a business. So can you kind of go back to the results from NAEP for a little bit and kind of give us some insight there?
So I think there are a couple of parts of it that are really interesting. So one is that you see this big drop. The second is that you do see this widening. So the 10th percentile dropped off much more than the 90th percentile. So you have, low achieving students and high achieving students, and that difference, you really see the drop in the low achieving students. So again, you see what we've seen in the kind of more detailed tests. You can see that in the NAEP test as well. You tend to see bigger drops in math than you do in reading. And I think that is because math is taught more in school than reading is. That you learn reading at home. It could also be something about it's a little bit harder to measure some of the reading skills than some of the math skills. as a result, my guess is that the math will drop off. It's a more precise measure, so it will drop off more, but it will come back more. I wouldn't be surprised if we're able to pull back math up a little more easily than we are reading. Because so much goes in. We think of math as very linear, but really reading requires not only your ability to read, but then to learn from what you read. And there's a whole bunch that goes into what's there that's a little bit harder to impact. So while people have focused on it's the problem is in math, I'm less inclined to say that. I think we do see it in both, and the difference, while there, I'm not sure reflects how hard it will be to catch up. And then for the early grades, we have also seen really big drops particularly in our 5 and 6 year olds, who you would, just be beginning to learn to read, in reading there as well, even though that's not on the NAEP, because the NAEP does the 4th and the 8th graders. But I do take away, and then you can look at the subgroups, and we do see much bigger effects for the students who are traditionally lower performing as well.
I think in one of the studies, and this is also a question from the audience, you have mentioned, or it was mentioned in some of the things that we read about, major problem that doing this, with the drop in scores, indicate that students have been kind of disengaged from school and sense of identity loss, because I think school, that's something that you take it for granted. You go to school, and with the school closures here in Hong Kong, I think it was, I think the study said we had 400 plus days of school closure, and that's not unusual. I think in North America, my understanding, it's some of them is several months, and in certain parts of the world, it's a year or a year plus. So I think in terms of the identity and in terms of disengagement, how do you kind of now bring them back? I mean, it's originally, when we were talking about COVID, in the initial thought, it was going to be really a short term, a year at the most, but it's been 3 years. And how do you think that's going to be? I think what you've talked about, the tutoring will kind of help mitigate some of the problems. And I think, like you said, certain more affluent families can probably deal with this more, but we're talking about some of the families who are not as well off, and their impact is going to be a lot more. So how do you, I know one of the ways is through the tutoring, but how do you think that's going to, in the long term, if we don't address this, how is that going to affect societally down the road?
Yeah, I think there are two things. One is, yes, if we don't address it, it's really problematic, because there's so much that happens when students drop out of school, in particular, where they have much less economic opportunity, but it also affects their health and the relationships that they have, and crime, and all of these other things that have large impacts on society. So I think it's really so important that we figure out how to re-engage students in school. My sense is the only way to re-engage them is somehow by having them develop the close relationships that they need to be willing to put in the effort that it will take to learn what they haven't learned, to change what has become common for them in terms of their day-to-day activities, to readjust. I think, we say often that learning is a social enterprise, but I think here is an example where it really has to be, that there's so much. I'm a great believer in what we can get from technology in terms of targeting the instruction towards the exact things that students need. And there's all these kinds of benefits, but it has to be based in a relationship, because otherwise the students in particular, and, we have a particularly unequal society, a particularly wide variation of opportunities for students. And because of that, you really need the schools. You can't rely alone on families to do this. They're just such unequal capacities to provide these kinds of resources for students. And so we have to think nationally through public through our public school system, through our healthcare system, what do we do to make sure that each student has an adult who knows them and cares about them and can help them re-engage in school? And, you want it to be fun too. You want them to really like being there as well.
Well, I think one of the things we're learning here in Hong Kong is because the school was closed for so long this last 3 years, some of the issues the students have, I mean, sometimes a problem reading or problems at home were not spotted by the teachers or people who care for them because of school closure. So I guess one of the questions from the audience is the length of time out of the classroom. It does make a difference, doesn't it? That there is no one. And also in the US, some of the schools provide hot lunches. I mean, that's sometimes the only time a student has a hot meal a day. I think that also, I've heard similar situations in UK and other developed countries as well. It's not just developing countries. So I guess the length of time in school, I think maybe previous to COVID, we kind of took school for granted or teachers for granted. And obviously this last 3 years, we realized, and especially here in Hong Kong, where online school, we have situations where, small apartments, when you have one kid is different, but parents are working from home, and then you have 2 or 3 kids or grandparents, multi-generational. Obviously, school and teachers is very much needed, kind of in many ways, you talked in your presentation. So is there been kind of also studies of how, time of school closure has impacted the way the students learn?
Yeah, they aren't kind of the highest quality because you don't know, maybe the places that closed more had more intensive COVID. And so it's very hard to do a really high quality study of that. But yes, it certainly seems like the effects were bigger in places that closed more. I think many teachers and school leaders and bus drivers did an amazing job really in trying to do things like get meals to families. There was in the district where I live, there was just a lot of work that went into it because, as you said, it's so important. It's how kids get the nutrition that they need, as well as the education that they need is through the school system. And educators were working really hard to make sure that was happening, which is, it meant that they didn't maybe have the concentration and they didn't have the technology to be able to reach the students academically in the same way. But I think you're right. The interesting thing about time is that it's going to be really, really hard to catch up if we don't do things differently than what we've done before. Because, I mean, maybe you can give kids another year, but in general, expanding the school day, increasing the time, it's really hard. A fourth grader can't necessarily go for 2 more hours in a school day and learn very much. I studied one school district that tried to do that and in fact found negative effects of that. It's not easy to figure out what to do, but more of the same isn't really going to be what we need to do to support these kids. And I think we really have to think each child at a time, because there are many kids who were fine during the pandemic, that they did have a place where they could work. They had a computer, they had parents who could support them. And they had a school system that maybe had more capacity at the time to do it than other ones did. But there are other kids who didn't. And those are the ones that we really have to make sure get these additional supports to kind of have their identity as a student, feel engaged in school, and that they can be successful. And that's going to take both the kind of social emotional mentoring, but I do think it also takes showing them that they can be academically successful. And that's really why we think this kind of one-on-one or small group instruction is so important. It's because that's where they can be academics, can see that they can be academically successful.
But it's interesting in doing the research, I think, I don't know if it's McKinsey or one of the studies, says average students in high income countries would lose about 35,000 over his or her lifetime. And here in Hong Kong, I think the numbers is more like, I think we have one of the think tank that also did similar studies based on those equations. In Hong Kong, average, if we don't address some of this in the students of this period, average loss would be 42,000 actually average loss for Hong Kong, the loss is quite substantial between the
Yeah.
low income family and a high income family. It's almost a double. So I think those are issues that definitely has to be addressed while we can. So I guess then now I wanted to ask you, what if there's another pandemic? I mean, in 3 years, we've learned a lot, and like the science side of it, in terms of how fast we got the vaccine, the way the scientists and the researchers, the doctors dealt with it. But I think on the social science aspect, on this area, if we have another pandemic, how should school, teacher, society deals with this? I mean, here in Hong Kong, unfortunately, early in when we had the fifth wave, the school was closed. In fact, to this day, students have to still take every day the rapid antigen test to go to school. They're so used to it now, and they're still wearing masks in school. In fact, there has been incidental. I have friends who say their kids, if they're at third or fourth grade, they don't recognize their classmates or teachers because everybody's been wearing masks. We're still wearing masks in school. So how do you now kind of address that in terms of what if? I will hope we don't have another one, but science shows that, there could be another one. So what are some of the lessons learned from this past 3 years in terms of education, disruption in education?
Yeah, well, I think we made great leaps and bounds in technology as one thing. So I do think that we can be much more effective in online education than we certainly were during this time period, where, many of our students didn't have Wi-Fi connections. They couldn't get on Zoom. We didn't really, Zoom wasn't really a thing at the beginning of the pandemic. I used it in my work, but it certainly wasn't a typical thing for people to be using. I think we realize now how important, again, these relationships are. So to make sure that each student really can connect with the teacher. And in that way, some districts in the US did a pretty good job when they were going back, making sure that the students who got back first were the ones who needed it the most. So that in a pandemic, when you have to change the way things are working, you have to really think about this variation. Like we saw, there were a group of kids on average who really didn't have any bad effects in terms of their learning. And so you really say, well, this is a group that can be successful through this online. And that way we can, reduce the density of students in their classroom and things like that. So I think we're just much more sophisticated about things like that, have a greater understanding of the importance of human connection, and we have better technology to do it. I do think that we've also developed these kinds of platforms, again, the technology much better than we've had before. So I think we do a better job of doing it than we did, that we're in a much better place in that way. But it's not easy, just like education, even in person, isn't easy. When you really have kids with such different needs, to be able to meet those needs is hard. And you have to really think about each student and what their assets are, what they can really do well, and in what situations they can thrive. And then when it's limited because you've got a pandemic, then you have to again say, okay, well, we don't have that right now available, but let's still think about the students. And at the time when this happened, in 2020, we just, we didn't have anything set up to be able to do those kinds of things.
I think you in your presentation, and you also talked quite a bit about the pluses and minuses of technology. And can you kind of address that a little bit? Because here in Asia, and hearing anecdotally from many of my colleagues and friends, many of the parents seem to be not as favorable in terms of using technology. Even the schools were, I think I heard one of the schools here doing a Zoom session, they discouraged the students from using Zoom to chat with their students because they're afraid of eye strains and so on. So here, technology is a double-edged sword. I mean, there are pluses, like you said. I think some students will benefit quite a bit from it, but there are certain things that I was reading about in terms of study that technology could be very helpful in. So, from your vantage point as a researcher and educator, talk about the pluses and minuses of education. And you're also where you are, you're in Stanford, and technology, how that will play in the future. I think here in Hong Kong, we've been talking a lot about AI, and you're gathering a lot of data from this last 3 years. We have tons of data from all over the world about education. So I think, can you glean from your perspective about the pluses and minuses of technology in education?
Yeah, so my conclusion is that there are some students, of course, who can learn from a computer program, from a game, where they really love having the balloons go off if they get an answer right. But that is not most students. And it's certainly not the students who have the most difficulty in schools. So I actually don't think in the end that computer-assisted learning, where you're just a student is on a computer, is going to be transformational, and particularly not good for closing achievement gaps and addressing some of our students who are struggling the most. That said, there are these great potential with technology that can provide educators with information on students that can really help them in their teaching, allow them to differentiate much more. I for this kind of tutoring that I've been talking about, I really imagine a different set of educators in schools so that you have a differentiated workforce. You've got some really master teachers who are certified and experienced and can create wonderful lessons where students learn how to discuss things and they work together. And then at the same time, you have adults in the school, maybe without the same kind of training or experience, who maybe it'll maybe a step towards becoming a master teacher, but who can really have a lot to offer individual students. Maybe they share life experiences, they love being with students, and with the technology, they'll be able to know through assessments and things like that what students need, where their holes are in their learning, and then be given a whole set of really high quality instructional materials that can help them help those students. So I think that if we think of technology not just as games that students play, but as communication tools and information tools for educators, that we really do, it really can be transformative in providing students with what they need to succeed.
Prior to COVID, I grew up in the States as a Chinese American. One of the biggest complaints has been the underinvestment in education, in especially public schools and so on and so forth. But with COVID, the government has thrown, my understanding is the largest one-time investment in American school of $190 billion. Averaged out to be 3,500 for average public K-12 students. So that's unprecedented. So now you have the resources to do something different. So can you talk about that possibility? And also, how do we, you also alluded in your presentation about teachers, a lack of teachers or recruitment, and that's going on all over, especially here in Hong Kong, because with the uncertainty of school closures, we have a lot of whether the international school or local school, almost every school I know are recruiting teachers. So now with this kind of resource in the United States, how do you recruit? How should you recruit differently? What kind of teachers or tutors that you should be recruiting? I think before that, many of the teachers were not very agile or happy with technology, and many of them have been in education field for a long time. But now, it's a one-shot deal. How, with that, are you? And I'm sure that's when your researcher is pointing to. How should we be recruiting for the next generation?
Yeah, so I really do think that we should be thinking about this often we've thought about a teacher as a teacher, and all teachers do the same thing and they have the same training. And that's what I think should be different as a result of this. We can have these different levels of teaching, these different strengths that educators bring to schools that really can allow us to address the differential needs of different students. So some students have problems in one area and could be really helped with working on that. We should be able to provide them with those supports, like the way that the higher income families do for their own students, for their own children. We should be able to do this as an education system. In the US, there's been a lot that higher education has been beginning to build the capacity to help support this. For example, a number of teacher preparation programs in universities are providing tutors to K-12 schools so that teachers in training tutor for a term instead of observing a class. And that not only is good for the K-12 students, but is really good for the teachers in training who get practice in that. But it's also true in our engineering schools. There are examples where the engineering students who grew up in these K-12 schools come back and they tutor in math. And that's good because maybe it will create pipelines for us, for teachers. We have a really hard time recruiting teachers with the math skills to teach high school math. And this could create that kind of pipeline. So I think if we think more about the pipelines into teaching, and maybe it will be a funnel where you've got a lot of people who try it. It's a really good educational experience as a college student, some of whom will stay and become our master teachers, and others of whom will become doctors or lawyers or engineers. But I think we have to think about schools and educators in a much broader way, because we also have a lot of evidence in the US that having a teacher who shares your experience, shares your race, shares your ethnicity or gender preference is very beneficial. And as a result, again, being able to differentiate the workforce is really important. So that's what I think about the workforce. What's great about this one-time infusion of funds is, as schools think about how to be creative, this is the one time that I've been working with districts where many of them are not worried about the money. It's a problem to change schedules. It's a problem to kind of figure out different human resource configurations or contracts or things like that. But for right now, for a couple of years, it's not the money that's getting in the way. And that's really a huge benefit for creativity and innovation.
Well, I think just listening to the news recently of a lot of the IT companies doing some major layoffs, and yesterday was Amazon, and there were other companies. So maybe some of them, even if they want to be contract workers, helping the school systems addressing some of these needs might really help the students. Ultimately, I think this is the students' needs that we're really looking at. But one of the questions that we have from the online audience is asked, if parents are not able to provide extra tutoring, and that's a lot of the ones who do not have the resources, what should they do to help their kids get back on track?
Yeah, so the tutoring that I was talking about was not actually provided by parents, but would be provided in the school system. So I think one way is to advocate for schools to support give the support that your child needs, and that all the children need in your school to be successful. So one is kind of more of a political action, but for individual students, there are kind of free resources to draw on. If you're a parent and you don't have the dollars, but do have time to put into your student, there are these kind of online programs that can help that are free. I would start with talking to teachers about what's available, so you can talk to the teachers. Again, as you mentioned, one of the big issues is that students themselves are disengaged and don't see themselves as students. So parents can do a lot just by kind of encouraging students, encouraging their children being understanding that it's a difficult time, but at the same time, helping them to kind of make the effort and trust that they'll be successful if they make it.
We're coming toward the end of the program, but I kind of wanted to end by asking you kind of this bigger question in terms of what the world, I think right now, what we're talking about today, the focus has been on the US, what have we learned? But I think every country, because this pandemic has affected everyone, whether you're low income country, high income country, affluent family, less fortunate family, it's impacted everyone. So has there been, I think in your studies, has there been kind of like what country has done better? For example, I think when we look at COVID, in terms of every country have had their learning curves. Sometimes they think they've conquered it. Every country have felt proud that they dealt with it, and then COVID comes back to bite them. And I think one of the things we're seeing now is in this part of the world, with we were so happy here in Hong Kong and China that we dealt with it. Maybe we might have dealt with it better in the beginning, but in the end, none of us escape. And so I think we've all learned. So has there been a kind of an effort that you're aware of that are, sharing this knowledge globally, from whether it's from a UN agency on education that are sharing, I think some of the stuff you're talking about is, yes, specific to the US, but because the US and China, large countries with, and in countries like I mentioned China before, tutoring is par for the course. Korea, here, Taiwan, and so on. So, is there a kind of the share knowledge that you're aware of that, or maybe even Stanford universities that are taking on that again, if COVID happens again, that we can have that share knowledge. Hong Kong can learn from US can learn from China, and vice versa, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important thing for us to develop. There is a lot of learning going on across countries. While I described what was happening in the US, very similar things are actually happening in lots of countries around the world. So it isn't really specific to the US, and not even to countries that are similar to the US. So certainly in Western Europe, but also in South America, there are many countries that are taking kind of similar approaches. So I do think that this isn't country specific. This is something that affected us across the world. I do think it's also brought to the fore the importance of children and of families in a way that we in many places had kind of forgotten. And so I think that's a good thing, to understand how important to the functioning of a country some of the kind of basic social services are. And so I think we have a lot that we can learn from this, and that people are really interested. And so there are tons of groups that are doing it, but I don't know of any in particular that is leading the way on this. So I think it will be really interesting to think about whether we can do things together to do this.
Well, I was telling you earlier, and before we started on the program, that I attended the Eden Prize on Education Award just about a month ago here in Hong Kong. And I know I've been a long admirer of the Eden Prize, Charles Eden, and the stuff that they're doing in terms of education. So I'm hoping that an organization like this, or somebody in the UN will be kind of take up a cause, because obviously, developed countries like the United States, which have the resource to throw that kind of money to look at this issue, obviously there's a lot of lessons we can learn from, and not every country can throw in that amount of resource to do that. So I'm sure there is a lot of things we can learn from the United States and other developed countries who have the resources to study the issue, and whereas I'm sure many of the poor country will not. But so sharing knowledge, and I think that's something that we hope that what this program has been able to do is to kind of plant some seeds, and then maybe in the future we can convene a whole bunch of you and talk about this when the pandemic is over, because we have been able to share that knowledge among the scientists, but I think the social scientists. So that's another question. I kind of wrap up with that. I feel, has the role of the social scientists, have their role been kind of taken into consideration? One of the things when I was doing this series, the science, we all know who Dr. Fauci is. Many of the science, the scientists who are looking into the COVID, their words have been really seen as the truth. But I think the role of social scientists in COVID do you think that's something that we also come to appreciate after this? The role of educators, as school teachers, not just scientists, but teachers. So is that something that you hope to change the dial on?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that's right. I think that we've all recognized how hard the job of a teacher is, and that's not always good, because then teachers want to leave because their jobs are so difficult. But at the same time, I think there's an appreciation that we all have about the importance of the work and the difficulty of the work that we didn't have before. And I think that's really important for us always to keep in mind. I've actually found that there's been a lot more interest in kind of what the research, the social science research says during this time, because again, these decisions that we're making are so important. We can really see the impact of this on our lives, what the pandemic did, and that we really have this intense desire to do the best job we can to support students, to make things better for them, and for, in health as well. And so I do think that it is a time when social science, where people have turned to the research in social science in a way that they, at least in the US, don't typically do. And that's very heartening for the kind of work that I've been doing.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Professor Susanna Loeb, for joining us this morning and this evening, your time, to talk about something that I'm sure we will be discussing more in the days to come, because it's not over yet, unfortunately. And I think we are still worried about the impact of disruption on kids, whether it's K-12, high school, or college. So I'm sure we'll have more discussion on this topic. And I'm hoping in the near future, this series will come to an end. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to bring you great researchers and academic like Professor Loeb for in-depth discussion on the COVID situation. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, and stay tuned. We will have some exciting programs coming up in 2023. Whether it's in hybrid format or in person, we are so looking forward to bringing you back to Asian Society Hong Kong in person. But thanks to this exercise, we now can also engage world researcher academics from all over the world for formats like today. So again, thank you, Professor Loeb, for joining us, and all the best in your research. And we hope to bring you back for future discussions if we are able to convene some of the stuff that lessons learned from Hong Kong in terms of education, and lessons learned from this part of the world. So thank you.
I would love that. Thank you very much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.